What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I've been thinking about how I wanted to talk about these two guys, like in comparison, um, Moses Malone and Shaquille O'Neal. And let me state for the record that I do rank Shaq above Moses. Okay, um, historically, Shaq is right now hovering at the bottom of my top 10 right now. He's sort of hovering like right at a number 11 or number 10, whereas Moses is like maybe 14 or 15 or something like that, somewhere in that range. So they're close together, but I do have Shaq ahead of Moses. Um, I mean, you have to put Shaq ahead of him because Shaq, of course, won four championships to Moses one. And even though it's not just about rings, but when you look at the four championships and you look at the three finals MVPs, and compare that to Moses' one championship and one Finals MVP. Although it was one hell of a run in '83, didn't he? You got to put Shaq ahead of Moses. But I do want to say this though. I think that Moses Malone got more out of his potential than Shaquille O'Neal did. Like seriously, Shaq was so dominant at one stretch that he was threatening to become the GOAT, like legitimately the GOAT. But what hurt Shaq was his laziness, as Charles Barkley always points out to Shaq. And when Charles Barkley points you out to being lazy, you're lazy. Um, Shaq's laziness at times, as far as keeping his body in tip-top shape, um, his inability to make free throws, his inability to expand his offensive repertoire, although as dominant as he is, maybe he didn't need to at times, I guess. You know, and earlier on, until he started winning championships playing with Kobe Bryant and under Phil Jackson, Shaq was known as being a perennial loser, which is something people forget. You know, Shaq was swept out of the playoffs in '94. He was swept out of the playoffs in '95, of course, in '96. I think in '97 they lost 4-1 to Utah. In '98 they were swept out of the playoffs again, and in '99 they were swept out of the playoffs. You know, later on Shaq was on teams, the Miami Heat. I remember in 2007, I think it was, when they got swept unexpectedly by the Chicago Bulls, or either it was they were up two and they got swept. I can't remember. But I remember he got swept out of the playoffs quite a few times. Um, but getting back to my basic point, I think that Shaq is great. I think he's a top five all-time center. Um, you know, with Kareem, Wilt, Elijah Wan, and I guess Bill Russell. But he could have been, like I said, the GOAT. He could have been in the era that he played in, from 1992 or 93 until 2003-ish, 2004-ish. Shaq was the most dominant player in the NBA. I recall vividly when Michael was playing in the 90s, they would differentiate between Mike and Shaq. Mike was the best player, skills wise, but Shaq was the most dominant. And, Shaq was insane. I mean, like an average stat line for Shaq was 27 points, maybe 11 rebounds, maybe three blocks, you know, maybe three assists. He always shot somewhere between 58 to 62% from the floor. So he shot a very high percentage, as big and strong as he was. You know what I'm saying? So big and strong that, you know, really, if he was anywhere within, I'd say, if he was anywhere within 4 feet from the basket, you know, you couldn't stop him. We all saw what he did to Kim Mutombo in the 2001 NBA Finals. Even though Mutombo was older, but he made Mutombo look like a child, like a rag doll, like nothing. This is a four-time Defensive Player of the Year winner. Um, but there are some criticisms of Shaq. Like I said, he didn't take care of himself like he should have. He didn't work as hard at his craft as other greats did. And he kind of, lived off of his size and strength. And he had a bad habit of gaining lots of weight during the off season and being way out of shape during the preseason and then working himself in shape or into shape during the season. And that used to hurt the Lakers, because the Lakers especially, uh, because by the time he's getting heavier, um, because Shaq would have to play through the season to get into shape. So he would start off poorly. He would get nagging injuries because he wasn't in shape. And that's what kind of elevated Kobe a little faster than he probably would have, because he had to take up the slack for Shaq in so many different ways. Um, this is not to say that Shaq wasn't great. He was. He was phenomenal. But he could have been the GOAT. He should have been. Shaq really should be at least top three or four. And then another thing, because Shaq didn't take care of himself like he should have, he fell apart faster. To me, Shaq kind of stopped powering up, dunking as much around 2004, 2004-ish or so. The last that we really saw consistently of Shaq was maybe around 2006, 2007. Now, sporadically after which Shaq had some great games. I remember a 45-point game when he was with Phoenix in 2009. But for the most part, the last several years of Shaq's career, he was a journeyman, you know, and he limped literally out of the league in 2011. He was finished. Watching Shaq play in Boston in 2010, 2011 was sad to see him. When he got blocked by Nate Robinson, that's when I said to myself, Shaq needs to retire. You know what I'm saying? Moses Malone, on the other hand, got the most out of his potential. Moses, when he was 18 years old, he started in the ABA, I believe with the Utah Stars. And Moses was real skinny when he started. He was, at that time, just 6'9" and maybe 210 pounds. But he played the power forward position. But he had a knack for rebounding, a real knack for rebounding. And I saw someone make a point, and that basically Moses was sort of like Dennis Rodman without the distractions, but being able to make free throws and being a 20 points per game scorer. And that's pretty accurate, I guess. Moses was a bigger guy, but that's not that far off an assessment. As Moses got older, he got bigger. He reached 6'10" in height. Sometimes he played the power forward position, but as he aged, he became primarily a center. And he filled out to about 260, 270 pounds. So he was a big guy. Not quite as huge as Shaq. Not as big and strong as Shaq, but he was a big and strong guy. But Moses' thing was he was a more well-rounded player to me. Not being quite as big and strong as Shaquille, he couldn't just always bull himself to the basket. He was not a great leaper. So he had to sometimes work a lot harder to score. Um, Oftentimes, Moses would purposely just throw the ball up into what looked like a shot attempt. He would just throw it off the glass and catch the ball himself with the defense off guard and put it back up. That's why Moses is the all-time leader in offensive rebounders. He was an offensive rebounding beast. He's considered the greatest offensive rebounder in NBA history. He's amongst the greatest rebounders of all time. I believe he led the NBA rebounding 5 consecutive years, and he was. That's an area where he was vastly superior to Shaq. For a stretch, Moses was the best rebounder in the NBA, as well as the best center in the NBA, and for a while, the most dominant player in the NBA in the very late '70s into the early to mid 1980s. Shaquille O'Neal, for as great as he was, only had, I believe, 3 career 50-point games. He never led the league in blocks. He never led the league in assists. Excuse me, not assists, excuse me, rebounding. Oftentimes, he wasn't even in the top. If you look at listings per season, he wasn't even in the top 5 sometimes in rebounding, which used to shock me. And as Shaq got older and heavier and lost some of that bounce, he became a worse defender and rebounder. Now he was selective with his shot blocks. Like for instance, he would block someone who he knew if he saw little, you know, if he saw somebody like little Trenton Haskell, I think that's his name was with the Timberwolves. If he saw little Trenton Haskell make a ill-advised foray to the basket, he would come and block his shot into the second row. But if he saw Sean Kemp coming, he wouldn't be as demonstrative for trying to block his shot. Shaq was very selective in who he tried to block because he didn't want to be on a poster. The only guy to really dunk on him in his prime, I remember serving correctly, is Derek Coleman. Um, Moses was not a shot blocker per se. That wasn't his strength. Moses' strengths were uh, scoring in the post, but in more of in a workhorse manner. He wasn't a polished scorer. He did have, from what I can remember seeing from the few games I saw him when he was still playing and from footage, he did have a bit of a jumper. I'm not saying he was, Olajuwon or Nowitzki, but he had a little bit of a jumper from like 10 feet inward, maybe sometimes a little bit outward, past that if he was like hot or whatever. But he had a little bit of a jumper, and Shaq never really had one. And Moses was, like I said, a really hard-working guy. And to me, I think Moses was, in my opinion at least, a better leader and probably a better teammate. And Moses really carried a lot of those ball clubs, especially when he was with the Houston Rockets. For that team to have gone to the NBA Finals, I think that '81 Rockets team is still the only team to make it to an NBA Finals with a losing record, if I'm not mistaken. They were 40-42, and they upset the Los Angeles Lakers. That's another thing too. Moses Malone used to kill Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, partially because as great as Kareem was a finesse guy, and he did not like the bang. Does that sound familiar, Anthony Davis lovers? He was a finesse guy, great player, but he did not like the bang. So guys like um, Artis Gilmore, players like Moses, even Wilt gave him problems, even though Wilt wasn't a scorer like that no more by the time they were playing each other. Those players gave him problems. And Moses gave him a lot of problems. Moses was a tenacious rebounder, and he killed them all the time, you know what I'm saying? Um, but Moses didn't have the same type of team that Shaq had. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you think about it, when Shaq came into the NBA, he already had on that team Scott Skiles, um, Nick Anderson, Dennis Scott. You know, he already had some guys on that team already. Then later on, you had Penny Hardaway come on. Then you had the next season Horace Grant come. So you already have a squad when you're second, third year in the NBA. Then you go over to the Lakers, and that team is loaded with talent, but they just are leadership. They're leaderless. You know, they don't have a good coach. They don't have a good system. They're just winning some games by just having sheer talent, but they didn't really know how to win yet. But the thing is, he had a lot of talent on his teams. You know, even when he was with Miami, he had talent on his teams. Um, when I think about it, every goddamn team that Shaq went to, Cleveland with LeBron, Phoenix with Steve Nash, and later on Boston, he's always had talent. Shaq has always been surrounded by talent. Whereas a guy like Moses, when you look at those Houston Rockets teams, those teams were poor. The only great team Moses ever played on, in my opinion, like I gotta think about it before I say it, but I think it's true. The only great team he ever played on was that Sixers team. And the only reason why I think they didn't win more is because that team just kind of fell apart too prematurely due to age and injuries. You know what I'm saying? But I do believe that Moses got more out of his potential. Moses played at a higher level longer than Shaq did. And this is why I say this. From 74 on, 1974 until about maybe 1990 or so, or 91. Let me check out something right quick. Let me check out something right quick. I want to make sure I'm accurate when I'm saying this. Yeah, from 1974, when he was with the Utah Stars in the ABA, when he averaged 19 points, 15 rebounds, one steal, 1.5 blocks, and shot 57% from the floor. He was 19 years old, all the way until the 89-90 season. When he was with Atlanta Hawks, he was 34 years old, and he averaged 19 points, 10 rebounds, on 48% shooting from the floor, shot 78% from the foul line, and averaged 1.6, I believe, assists per game. All the way through that 16-year stretch, Moses Malone played at a high level. Now, his next season with the Atlanta Hawks, his minutes were cut tremendously, from 34 minutes a game to 23 minutes a game. But he still averaged about 11 points and 8 rebounds a game. And then in 91-92, when he was 36 years old, with the Milwaukee Bucks and playing only 31 minutes a game, he averaged 16 points and 9 rebounds a game on 47% shooting. So my point is, Moses played for 16, 17, going to 18 years at a very high level. It wasn't until the last 3 years of his career where Moses really started falling apart. You know what I'm saying? Age started really catching up with him. And it's interesting because back in 1986, right, when the Sixers knew that Julius Erving was going to be retired, they blew that team up. Andrew Toney was being, besieged by foot problems. Julius Erving, the doctor, had been demoted to an intern. By then, he was only averaging 16 points a game and only shooting maybe 44% from the floor. He wasn't the same player anymore. Next year would be his last, 86, 87. Moses, they thought, was diminishing, so they traded him. It's one of the worst. I did a video about this. I mentioned it about 2 or 3 years ago when I did a video about Charles Barkley. It's one of the worst trades in the history of the NBA. The Moses Malone trade the Sixers made. It was a horrible trade, and it set the franchise back so much. They basically traded Moses Malone for a pack of crackers and a packet of Tang, literally. And Moses would go on when they traded him. Now, don't get me wrong. Moses was no longer the guy putting up, 27 points and 15 rebounds. But that year before, he averaged 24 points and 12 rebounds. You know what I'm saying? We want Joel Embiid to put up numbers like that now. But they thought he was finished. So they traded him to the Bullets. The next year, he averaged 24 points and 11 rebounds. So, and he remained a 20 and 10 guy, 20, 11, or 21 and 12 for another 4 years. So Moses had a lot left in the tank. Whereas a guy like Shaq, he kind of fell apart rapidly. Shaq, because he didn't take care of himself, he fell apart by the time he was 30 years old. And, he didn't start as early as Moses did professionally. And he wasn't the workhorse, I got to say this again, that Moses was. Moses led the league in rebounding twice. In the 1978-79 season, he averaged 41.3 minutes a game. 1981-82, he averaged 42 minutes a game. Shaq never averaged anywhere near 40 minutes a game. So, I'm not trying to knock Shaq. I'm not. But I think that Moses, you can't even argue. You can even argue that Moses' peak was a little higher than Shaq. But he didn't sustain that as long as Shaq. But his peak was a little bit better than Shaq. Shaq's best season is considered what? The MVP year, 99-2000, when he averaged 29 points and, I don't know, maybe he averaged 12 rebounds, I'm thinking. Maybe 3 blocks, maybe three assists. He probably shot something like 59% from the floor, 58%. He had a great season. Moses Malone in the 81-82 season, which I think was the second year he won MVP, he averaged 31.1 points, a league-leading 14.7 rebounds, 1.8 assists, 2 blocks per game. He shot 52% from the floor and 76% from the foul line. And, he was, and Moses, like I said, won 3 league MVPs. And he was playing, and this is something else that has to be mentioned. Moses was playing in an era where his best performances, his best production, came when there was still a lot of dominant centers. You know what I'm saying? You still had a lot of dominant centers left in there. Of course, you had Kareem. You know what I'm saying? Of course, you had, Artis Gilmore. You still had Bob Lanier. You know what I'm saying? You still had, earlier on in his career, you had Wes Unseld. You know what I'm saying? You still had a lot of great centers in the NBA when Moses was at his best. You contrast that to Shaq in his best years. I'm not talking about in the 90s when he was coming up. I'm talking about his best years with the Lakers championship. The center position was really starting to fade off then. Eric Robinson was a shell of himself. Ewing was almost done. Mourning was, sick with the kidney issue. A lot of the great centers had retired by then. You know what I'm saying? So Moses was playing against superior center position players at the time. Jack Sick was another one. So there's a lot of other centers I can't quite think off the top of my head. But there were, better big men at that time. Robert Parrish is another one. Joe Barry Carroll. Bill Cartwright when he was in his best years, the Knicks averaging 20 and 10. So, Moses was going against superior competition. He, had weaker teammates, but yet individually, he was, to me, you could actually argue peak for peak a little bit more dominant, but his dominance wasn't as long. How can I say this? His peak was a little bit better than Shaq, but Shaq's peak years were better than Moses Malone years. But Malone's productive years were longer than Shaq. Then you look at Moses Malone's all-time career and how it plays out. When you add his ABA, and NBA careers, he has more points than Shaq. He has way more rebounds. In fact, I think when you add the ABA and NBA, he's third all time behind only Wilt and Bill Russell. And he's ahead of Kareem, despite playing in 230 fewer games. And at the end of the day, man, I just gotta give it to Moses, man. I think Moses doesn't get the same hype, because he didn't have a flashy game. He's seen as sort of basic, but he kind of has the same issue that a guy like Tim Duncan has. And you can also make the argument, you know, that like Tim Duncan, sometimes the system he played in outside of Houston held him back. When you're playing with when he's playing with the Sixers, he had to play on a team that had not only himself but Julius Erving. You had Mo Cheeks. He wasn't a scorer per se, but you had Mo Cheeks. You had who else was that team? You had Andrew Toney. So you had a lot of different guys who were scoring the basketball. So Moses could have still been a guy averaging close to 30 points a game, at that time. But anyway, that's pretty much all I got to say, man. I just think in a nutshell that Shaq is one of the greatest centers of all time. I would still rank him ahead of Moses, but I think Moses is the most underrated NBA player, perhaps, in the history of the NBA. People don't really grasp how great he was. You know what I'm saying? And that's all I got to say. Tell me what you guys think.